Good morning, Lakeshore Community, Lakeshore Collegiate. Welcome to the Jigme Kelsang Show. I am your host. Welcome to my very first episode. I am coming at you with a very special exclusive podcast interview with a very special guest who has graciously took her time out of her busy schedule to be here with us this morning. Lakeshore community members and staff and students, please give a warm welcome to MPP for Parkdale High Park, Bhutila Karpoche. Here's a bit of information explained about Bhutila. In June of 2018, Bhutila made history by becoming the first person of Tibetan heritage to be elected to public office in North America, even in the country of Canada. Bhutila is active on issues around social justice, public health. She is a longtime advocate of affordable housing, workers' rights, and public health care. An epidemiologist by training, Bhutila is a public health researcher focusing on the social determinants of health. Most recently, she co-authored the report, A Public Health Crisis in the Making, The Health Impacts of Precarious Work on Racialized, Refugee, and Immigrant Women. Bhutila holds degrees from the University of British Columbia, U of T, and is a PhD candidate in Public Health Policy at Ryerson University, where she received the RBC Immigrant Diversity and Inclusion Project Award. Bhutila has presented at many academic conferences and is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Queen Elizabeth Diamond Jubilee Medal. Lakeshore Community, Lakeshore Collegiate. Before I formally introduce Bhutila here on the Jigme Kelsang Show, I just want to start off by giving a huge shout out and thanks to Bhutila's constituency assistant, Carly Jones, for working tirelessly hard for communicating with me from the start of this long process till the end. Unfortunately, this long process came to a huge successful end. Carly, thank you for everything you have done, not only done for me, but for everyone on the LCI Radio 1 podcast crew. Thank you for allowing us to have its opportunity like this. I want to thank Mr. Murray, Mr. Easton, and the whole administration staff here at LCI for allowing me to have the opportunity to do these things whenever we have the time and chance to. Lastly, I want to thank everyone for your constant belief and trust in me. I'm so glad and excited that this is coming to fruition here today. Lakeshore community and staff and students, I now want to formally welcome Bhutila Karpoche here to Lakeshore Collegiate Institute and the Jigme Kelsang Show in partnership with LCI Radio 1. Thank you, Bhutila, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And can I just say, I am so excited that I am your first guest. I don't think I've ever been a first anywhere. Outside of just being elected. But I think this ranks right up there in terms of how cool it is.
Yeah, we're very excited. It's been a long time coming, and we're very glad to have you as our first guest here. But before we start the interview, we want to get to know everyone around the table. So today we have...
I'm Isa, and I'm part of the LCI Radio crew.
I'm Eve, and I'm also part of the crew.
Hey, my name is Mr. Murray, Vice Principal here at Lakeshore, and also part of the LCI Radio team.
All right, so we'll just get right into the interview. The first question we have for Bhutila is, what was the journey to Canada like?
Oh, wow. So the journey to Canada actually begins even before I was born. Because as many of you know, as was just mentioned in my intro, I'm a person of Tibetan descent. And so that journey for me actually began with my grandmother. When my grandmother was a young woman in Tibet, she experienced firsthand the occupation of her lands, Tibet, by the Chinese military. And as a result, she had to flee. She had to take her young children, which included my mom, and the same goes from my father's side of the story. And they fled to a neighboring country called Nepal. So they settled there thinking it was only temporary and that they were going to go back to Tibet because everything was going to be okay. That was the assumption. And 40 years later, we found ourselves as members of the Tibetan community, Tibetan refugee community in Nepal, still living in what we call exile, and still living as stateless people that are not technically recognized as refugees because the country Nepal is not a signatory of the UN Convention on Refugee Rights. And so here we have me, a third-generation Tibetan in Nepal, essentially stateless. And that meant that my future, and that includes my own children and anybody after that was not going to have a future that was going to be any different than my parents and my grandparents. And so recognizing the politics of the region and the politics of Tibetans in Nepal, my parents made the very difficult decision to uproot once again and move to Canada. And so we came to Canada in 2002. I was already 18 years old, so I'd already lived quite a life back home. And it was not easy because everything that I had ever known, my entire world, was back in Nepal. And so imagine 18 years old, you're finished high school and you're coming into Canada. I missed my friends. I was thinking about, gosh, like I'm going to be in a new country. Where am I going to go meet friends and make friends and meet people? So, anyways, but we came. And like many other Tibetan and also actually many other refugee and newcomer communities, we landed in Parkdale High Park. So Parkdale was my first home, and I was just so thrilled because I had a very different idea of what Canada was and was going to look like. In fact, I didn't know much about Canada. But when I landed, I just felt such a strong sense of community, and it was just great to see visually even the diversity of the community. I always like to tell, how I was actually quite surprised in my first few days in Canada. I saw roti shops and I saw, Tibetan elders wearing their traditional outfit walking. And I even saw one time a car full of young Tamil youth blasting music in their language. And I thought, how cool is that? This is Canada. So that's sort of my journey here. And I think it's because of that strong sense of community that I was able to feel a sense of belonging into my new country, and the great neighbors and community organizations around that really helped in my family and me settling into Canada and rebuilding our lives here.
Wow, that's quite a story. I mean, because I actually have, well, not like the same story, but my family, we moved to Parkdale too. We lived in Parkdale for a number of years, right? So we lived in the King Street West area. So
Same
great
as me,
memories
on
with them
Tyndall
because
Avenue.
yeah, a lot of my cousins actually live in Parkdale. So it's a really good community. It's amazing.
Yeah, and in Parkdale, it's actually sometimes called the landing strip, right? Because so many people come to Parkdale, to kind of get their feet wet, so to speak, in Canada, and then they move from Parkdale into other parts of the city and other parts of the province and even the country. And I think that what you just said in terms of how my story sounds very similar to your story, and you know what? It's going to sound similar to so many other stories. We all share that, experience of coming into a country and, having these journeys that, take us to places and at the end of the day brings us together.
Yeah, like you said, we all have not like the same stories, but we all have different stories, But once we share those stories, we can make a change for the better, So I'll give you props on that one. That one's amazing.
Thank you. Props on the first question. How good is that?
So the second question we had, I don't know if you answered it in the first question we had, but how did it feel being a newcomer?
Oh, yeah. So I kind of touched on that. I was a little bit nervous, of course, right? Because I was a teenager, I was 18. I do remember actually discovering the Parkdale Public Library and getting very excited that I could use the computer for free. And of course, I spent all my time, at that time, we used to use the MSN Messenger. I'm dating myself again. And so I used to spend, whatever time I had on the computers talking to my friends back home and saying, hey, now I'm here in Canada. Like, what are you doing? But really, in terms of trying to now navigate a new country, a new place, and even a new system of doing things, I really found a lot of support from so many of the fantastic community organizations that are in the area that specifically want to help newcomers and anybody actually to access services, to make sure that people, if they're facing any issues or challenges or barriers, that they're able to address that. One story I will share, and I actually shared this story for the first time when I gave my acceptance speech for the nomination. So we were, as I mentioned, on Tyndall Avenue. It was a high-rise building. And one day in our apartment, late at night, there was a knock on the door. And when we opened the door, it was our neighbor from down the hall. And, it had only been a couple of months since we had moved into the building and moved into Canada overall. And she asked us if we wanted her TV set. And we're like, are you serious? Sure. We didn't have one at that time, so we gladly accepted it. And she knew that we were new to the country, and she was planning on buying a brand new set. So she gave us her perfectly working, very nice TV set. And she could have sold it. She could have given it to somebody, like she knew, her friends or whoever. But she made the effort to come down, knock on our door, and, give us basically the first option of taking it. And so that night, we were so excited. We were trying to figure out how to set it up and everything. And my little brother at that time was about 9 or 10 years old. And he was so worried. He was so worried because he thought that the next morning she was going to change her mind and that we were getting excited for no reason. So the next morning, he actually went over to her apartment and knocked on her door just to make sure, he pretty much asked her, do you know what you did last night? You gave us your TV set. Are you sure? And she was like, yeah. She had a good laugh. So, I share the story just because those were the kinds of experiences we had as newcomers. We had amazing neighbors, amazing people that really made us feel like we belong to the community. And I think that makes such a big difference, because the worst thing anybody can feel is that they don't belong. And especially for a newcomer, think about all the anxieties around being accepted and adjusting into a new place. So I just have to give props to, the wonderful people in the community, in the neighborhood, and, in the country that were very welcoming.
Mm-hmm. So, because you have studied at University of British Columbia and University of Toronto and Rice University, which my brother's actually studying in right now.
Okay,
So
cool.
he's studying business. So the third question we have was, what was it like studying at those universities?
Mm-hmm. So as I mentioned, I had finished high school when I came to the country, and I knew, okay, next step is to go to university. But I had come at a time when the applications for September, I came in the summer in June, and the applications for September were pretty much done and over with. So I had some time and I was trying to figure out. I knew that the goal was for me to go to university and get an education, because I knew that education was pretty much going to be the opportunities, be the thing that was going to open up opportunities for me. And so, in between, I did all sorts of jobs. I worked in factories. I, was volunteering in different organizations in the community. And then finally, when it came to do my applications, I was super eager, again, back in the library, working on my applications. And actually going to different service agencies to do my printing, because they had a limit on how much you could print. So I'd go to one and do a bunch of printing, and then go to the other place and do another bunch of printing, and just working on my applications. And now think about it, I didn't know any of the Canadian universities, right? And I had nobody that could guide me to tell me, hey, maybe you should consider this program, or this university might be good for this or that. So it was sort of like a process where I had to kind of read up on, but also make my own guesses about what, each university offered and what it looked like. Anyways, I'm glad I ended up making a good decision. So I went to Vancouver. I did my bachelor's in science, and the decision to go to Vancouver was really, at the end of the day, based on scholarships, right? Tuition is expensive, and at UBC, I was accepted as an undergraduate scholar, so I decided that that's where I want to go. And then I was so excited that there were mountains there, something that I had missed a lot, having grown in Nepal. Yeah.
Yeah, connecting back to that question, because now that, well, we're in grade 12, what advices would you give to us grade 12s, especially because now we're applying to college and universities now? That's it's the time of year right now.
Yeah.
So, what kind of advices would you give us?
So I'll tell you what I did, which I think is not necessarily the best way to go about it. So I went by university ranking. And I think that unfortunately, a lot of us get sucked into that. But there's so much more to a university than ranking. You know, do you like urban centers or do you like more, less busy? Do you like a big university or do you want it to feel more, like a college setting? So I think that there are so many different things that is so dependent on what your style is, but also what kind of environment do you think you're going to thrive in, right? And that's different for everybody. So I ended up going to basically big universities in general. So UBC is very big, U of T is very big. Ryerson is still very big, but it was kind of a change for me in the sense that it was among the smaller ones. And through my journey, I realized I actually like big centers, big urban centers. I like studying in cities because I like that life of, not only studying, but perhaps even working and doing things that are happening around the city.
So what program did you study at U of T?
Oh, yes. So at U of T, I did my master's in public health in epidemiology. And epidemiology is very interesting because it's actually very statistics heavy. It's a very technical degree. And so I had done all of that. And then in my program, we had an opportunity to do, it's not called a minor, but it's a second stream. And that second stream I did on global health. So global health, we talk a lot about, social issues, the state of the world in terms of its impact on health and things like that. And interestingly, even though now I'm trained and accredited as an epidemiologist, it was my second stream in global health that really took me down the path of policy and understanding how, potent policy was in terms of its impact on population health. So that's sort of what I studied in public health, and that's, the thing that I ended up pursuing further. And so at Ryerson, I am a PhD candidate, and my program is public health policy.
So, we understand that you worked with Cheri Di Novo
Yes.
as her constituency assistant.
Mm-hmm.
What was that experience like?
Oh, it was great. So one of the things was that I was already active, like in the community. I had joined organizations like Students for Free Tibet, a youth organization, where I felt like, okay, even though I'm in Canada, I can still work towards promoting human rights in Tibet and work on campaigns that freed political prisoners. So I was very active, and it was just a great place because I was able to connect with other youth that had similar interests and passions. So I was active there, and one of the things that I'm sure many realized, and I realized as a young activist, was that how interconnected issues are, and how all of our struggles are kind of the same, and the importance of lending solidarity. We can't work in our silos. We have to work with each other. And, only when you offer solidarity to others, then can you expect others to offer solidarity back. And understanding and realizing that through my work, I realized, yes, human rights in Tibet is important. It's a priority for me because of who I am as a person, but I'm also a tenant. And tenant rights are important. Affordable housing is important. It's important to my neighbors. It's important to me locally. And so I started getting active around housing issues, and I was able to see connections around that. And so as I got involved into the community, I one day, out of the blue, got a call from Cheri's office saying, we heard about you. I had met Cheri a couple times before because as our local MPP, then I was already bugging her about a few things. And so she reached out to me and so basically said, come work for me. And it was great because now I was doing community organizing work, but I was actually getting paid for it as opposed to doing it on the side as a volunteer. So that was pretty cool. And I think that that sort of was my entry into Canadian electoral politics. So, like political work, yes, I'd always been active, but Canadian electoral politics was my path into it was as a constituency assistant.
So the next question we have for you is, what inspired you to get into politics?
All right. So I actually get that question quite often. And I think that, sometimes when we think about politics, we think about elections, campaigns, political parties, elected representatives, and politicians, and all of that. But what we forget or fail to recognize is that our whole lives are actually political, right? Because when you think about every little thing that impacts our day-to-day life, for example, all of you are students, right? The fact that you are at Lakeshore Collegiate and you're able to study in a public school, that's because a political decision was made to fund public schools, that public education was recognized as being something important in society for us here. From things like where you live at home to how much you pay for groceries to, how reliable is the transit you take to school. All of those things are political decisions that are made, by not only us as a community, but as governments that impact our day-to-day lives. So recognizing that, and especially for me, having the lived experience that I've had, where having been born into a third-generation stateless person, that was not my choice. It was because of the politics of the country at that time and the politics of the region. So you can see how even before I was born, the politics of that was already influencing my life. So when people ask me, how did you get into politics? I feel like we're all born into politics, and that we just need to recognize, how politics influences us on a day-to-day basis, and whether we choose to act on it or not.
Mm-hmm. So now that you've explained to us what inspired you to get into politics, what inspired you to run for MPP at Parkdale High Park?
Oh, yes, for sure. So there were quite a few things. I was very, very involved in political work, and I absolutely loved it, right? So that was a good thing. I was already working with my predecessor, the former MPP for Parkdale High Park, and I knew what that life was like as a politician. Tough for sure, but at the same time, I could see how rewarding it is. And at the same time, I felt that around the time when it was time for me to make a decision of whether I wanted to do it or not, I realized and I recognized how the world around us has changed so much. Inequality is growing. In a rich, wealthy province like Ontario and country like Canada, we still have homelessness. We still have people who can't afford to pay their rent, who can't afford to eat. We are cutting services. So there were so many things in terms of how it was changing. Also internationally, right? Like Trump was just elected in the US. I remember during the time when I was going back and forth in terms of whether I should run or not, he had introduced the Muslim travel ban. And there was this very strong anti-refugee rhetoric that was, going around. And I almost felt that it was an obligation for me to run because there's that certain narrative, for example, like the narrative of refugees coming in to take. They come because they don't have something back home. And when they're here, they just want to take benefits of the services that are available in countries like Canada. But actually, it's not that narrow perspective. It's more than that. And that, somebody like me who came as a refugee to Canada, I'm as Canadian as anybody. And guess what? I too want to work really hard to build our country together, right? And so it's so important for people to hear that alternative narrative, see that alternative narrative through the election of people that come from these backgrounds. And, I've always been a very strong believer in that you can't just talk the talk, you got to walk the talk. And then, if we were going to change politics, if we were trying to change how the status quo was working, then I at least got to give it a shot. So that's why I ran.
Take us through what you were feeling on election night. Were you nervous, excited, or just in general, what were you feeling? And where were you watching the coverage of the results?
Yeah. Oh, yes. So, campaigns are a very, very long process. So we do have the 1 month right before election day when it is quite intense because you see signs around. There's a lot more political ads on TV and radio and everywhere. It's sort of like in your face quite a bit. But the important groundwork begins even way before that. So just to give you an idea, election was June 7th, right? I was not June 7th, 2018. I was nominated as the candidate in September of 2017. Now, mind you, I had to already begin a campaign in order to win the nomination. That campaign began December 2016. And so it's already taking us a year and a half before the actual election day of knocking on doors, phoning people, talking to people, listening to what are important issues for the community, and then trying to take action on them and trying to build a network of support of people who will help you reach that end goal. So it was a very, very long process. So by the time we got to June 7th, I thought, oh gosh, thank goodness we're here. I never thought this day would arrive. But also I had a very, very good feeling that I gave it my best, right? Like I worked hard for a year and a half, focusing and making the campaign the priority. And also I felt really proud that our campaign we ran a very, very positive campaign. We didn't engage in any of the negative attacks. We stayed positive. We weren't cynical about anything. We talked a lot about the possibility of the future and the worlds that we wanted to see and work to build towards. And I really was so thankful that we had an amazing, amazing group of volunteers who were so dedicated that, they went out day in and day out, knocking on doors and inspiring people to believe in something more hopeful and something better for us all in the future. So by the time election came around, I just knew that we had, I couldn't have been prouder of a better campaign. We ran as best as we could. Election days, you never know. It's unpredictable in terms of how, it's going to go. But I just got a very good sense that things might work out okay because on election day, I didn't do anything. I had a face mask on, and then I went out for lunch to Bark Barbecue, but the whole day, my phone just kept going off. And I was like, oh. And it was all really amazing because it was all people tagging me on posts, whether it's Twitter or Instagram, saying, I voted for Bhutila, I voted for Bhutila. I was like, wow, this is pretty cool. So I had a good feeling, but I just wanted to make sure. And so I was at home with my family when the results were coming out. And then I think CBC declared me as the winner. And then my campaign manager called me and said, okay, you've won. Now you can come to your own party. So I made my way down quickly. Went to the party. Obviously, tons of people there. I remember feeling so full, so happy and full. And it was just amazing that, we were able to succeed in our mission.
Mm-hmm. Well, that just answered the question I had upcoming. But the question was that was coming up was, what was your first reaction when you found out you had won by a clear landslide?
Right.
Which you clearly had won by just 20,000. I mean, people don't really think that's a big deal, but it is a big deal, let me tell you. My parents actually didn't really believe that you would actually win. But I told them, you know what? She's a Tibetan. You have to be proud of her. We have to support Tibetans each and every single day, you know. And I told him, watch, Bhutila is gonna win.
Oh.
And I'll prove you wrong. She's gonna win. And then by the time I checked the results, 'cause I was checking as it was going, right? So as soon as I saw that you had won by a landslide, I'm like, what did I tell you?
You knew all along.
Yeah, because I was actually trying to tag you on Twitter and everything,
Oh.
right? So I'm like, okay, she won.
I just have a question.
Sure.
What do you think you did different that made you successful, like in the race, like in terms of just, like during the campaign or just like in general, how you were, like carrying yourself?
Yeah. I don't know for sure, but what I think worked was that one, I was not somebody who was claiming to, work hard for the community. I had a history of working in the community. So that trust between the community members and myself was much easier to establish. And trust goes a very, very long way, right? People can read up on me. People can talk to others who I've worked with. And also having lived and worked and been part of the community basically ever since I came to Canada 16 years ago, a lot of people were already familiar with my work. So, that trust was there. And second, it really helped that the party I was running for, the NDP, we had an excellent platform. We were actually talking about things like making sure we had dental care as part of our healthcare system, that, we wanted to make sure we address rent control issues. These are issues that impact people in a very, very significant way, and people wanted to vote for a platform that took care of these core issues. And also, I think at the end, as I just mentioned, we just ran a campaign that focused on the positives of, it was more like forward looking, it was more future looking, thinking about how we can work together and how, if we really wanted to, we could make a huge difference and change society in a dramatic way for the better. So I think those kinds of messages really resonated. And I have to say, at the end of the day, actually, and perhaps this is the most important point, that we won because of the dedication of our volunteers. No campaign, no matter how much money you put into it, can run if people are not inspired enough to volunteer and talk to neighbors, strangers, everybody. So there was that dedication from, I think, almost 600 volunteers we had that, really made the difference.
I saw on your Twitter that you got to meet Ocasio-Cortez,
Yes.
Alexandria. How was that experience like? Just meeting her, because I know like she's really big on the news right now, especially. How did you even meet her, like in the first place?
Sure. So it was a weekend, and my husband was traveling for work, and I thought, oh, this is a perfect opportunity for me to, join him in New York. And I had been following Ocasio-Cortez's campaign quite closely. And luckily for me, I have a lot of friends in New York who are community activists and organizers and had been involved quite heavily in politics. So I just kind of put out an email out there to a bunch of my friends saying, does anybody have any connection? And turns out, yeah, people knew, a lot of them had mutual friends and connections who were directly involved in Ocasio's campaign. And so I said, I'm coming down. If there is an opportunity to meet, I would love to meet that. And it just sort of happened. One person made an introduction to another, and the next thing I knew, I was like standing there and talking to her. So it was very cool. And also, we actually went down to Bronx. So she represents sections of Bronx and the Queens area. So it was nice to go there and even observe, how they do rallying. And I heard her speak live. She gave a great speech. And, part of the interest for me was also because she was so successful in her campaign. And for me, being, an elected representative here, I wanted to see, like, what does she and her campaign do differently that I can learn from? So I stuck around for a while. I attended the rallies. I was trying to observe how they work. And one of the things that really blew my mind was how young the group was in terms of the people there that was trying to, make a difference. And also how diverse it was. So those were big lessons for me to, bring back. And also like small technical things that they were doing, which we don't do here. So it was both, an incredible experience for me to meet her and talk to her, but also to learn a little bit in terms of campaigning.
So I think it speaks a lot to the power of social media and the fact that Jigme was able to reach out to your campaign manager or yourself and have you here today and making those connections. So how has social media sort of played a part in your sort of campaigning and I know you're very active, and what do you see the advantages or maybe potential disadvantages of that?
Sure. Absolutely. It's such a great tool to reach people very quickly and very widely, right? So, for example, if I put out something on social media, sometimes it can get out within minutes to hundreds of people. And if I was to do the same thing, but do door knocking, which is equally important, but, to talk to people, to talk to say about 100 people, I'd have to spend at least a couple weeks knocking on doors because one, I might not meet them. And even the little time we have in terms of talking one-on-one, it might be taken up on some other issue than maybe what I wanted to talk, or maybe what that person wanted to talk to me about. So it's really great. We're already spending so much time on our phones and our screens, right? So instead of trying to not instead of trying to figure out, but like if we really want to engage people in politics and in issues that impact us greatly, then we have to make it as simple as possible. So we have to basically go where the people are. So I can't say, oh, I'm going to be here, everybody come here. No, me as an elected representative and as a politician, my job is to go where people are, and people are on social media. So I have to use that platform to make sure that, we're also talking about issues around the province. So that's an advantage. The disadvantage is that sometimes people can make the mistake that social media is everything when it's not. That one-on-one interaction is still very important. Nothing beats a personal connection. And from a social media, you can get a sense of what that person's about and what that person stands for, but that one-on-one connection in person, face-to-face, is really valuable. The other thing is that social media can do a lot of good, but it can also do a lot of harm. And I can tell you that, based on my own experiences, from trolls to people DMing me stuff I don't want to read, nasty things, right? So you are vulnerable in that sense. And people have, they can hide behind that anonymity of a profile account. So you just have to kind of remind yourself that that this is not everything, and if somebody's attacking you on social media doesn't necessarily mean it's true, and so you have to be very, very cognizant of your own mental health. That can take a serious hit.
So the next question I had prepared was, what does it mean to you being the first of Tibetan heritage or descent ever to be elected into public office in North America and even the country of Canada?
Mm-hmm. So it was quite interesting because for me, my goal was to be the MPP for Parkdale High Park, right? And as a consequence of that was that I became the first person of Tibetan heritage to get elected into office. I think that because as Tibetans, we've had 3 generations of moving one place to another place to another place, and having a strong and a fairly sizable community in Parkdale High Park, it felt that the community was able to send a message that, yes, and kind of what I said earlier, yes, we came to Canada as refugees and that we're very grateful to Canada, but we too want to help build our communities and our country. And I can just tell you, based on the interactions I've had, especially with Tibetan elders, like our seniors, they felt that because of my win, it was almost like a win for the community. And they felt that the community was giving back to Canada after having received so much support from Canadians.
The next question we had was, what are you pushing to do for youth and their education at this moment and in the future?
Sure. So I'll just very quickly actually talk about one of the bills that I'm working on, and its focus is specifically on children and youth. So as part of the official opposition, I'm the critic for mental health and addictions. And in the area of mental health and addictions, what I have found is that there is a real lack of standards in our province. One, because mental health has been so stigmatized, right? But we've come a long way in terms of raising awareness around mental health, but we haven't done the follow-up work, which is to make sure that there are services for people who are now coming forward saying, I need help in so-and-so areas. And I feel very strongly that if we want to have a very effective intervention, it has to be early intervention. And children and youth right now are waiting years in order to be able to receive access to mental health services. So I have tabled a bill that basically says any child or youth in the province of Ontario, if they need access to a mental health and addiction services, then the province has to make sure that they get it in a timely manner. And I've defined that as no more than 30 days. Because we know that wait times can exacerbate conditions, and if it's taking years, it can get to a crisis point. And when it comes to health, the one thing we always have to keep in mind is we have a strong public health care system. And if we're waiting until somebody reaches a crisis point and goes to an emergency hospital, we're actually paying more in terms of public dollars, spending way more to treat them at that point than if we had just invested a little bit more upfront in prevention. And that preventative work actually improves their quality of life. They don't need to get to that crisis point, and they're able to be much healthier and productive members of society. So, it not only makes moral, ethical sense, but it also makes strong economic sense as well.
So now that you've touched on the 30-day max waits for youth mental health, I wanted to actually get a little bit more clarity on what you're doing for fix our schools. So what do you planning to do that in that area?
So I can tell you as a parent as well of a kid who goes to an elementary school that many schools not just in Parkdale High Park, actually across the city and province, are in not so great shape in terms of maintenance, right? We have schools that are crumbling in many different areas. And so as politicians and even generally, like everybody loves to say, oh, kids are our future, right? Oh, and education is really the great equalizer of society, that through education, everybody is going to have equal opportunity. So if we value kids and our, and children, and if we value education so much, then how come is it that we're not providing adequate funding so that they're able to study and learn in environments that are healthy in environments that, are not too cold in the winter, not too hot in the summer, that they don't have to worry about leaky roofs or a boiler breaking down. There are so many kids that actually study years in portables. So, when it came to fix our schools, I took the pledge that, if elected, I would commit to ensuring that as a government and as the representative, I was going to advocate for fixing our schools, that we put enough money into school maintenance.
That's amazing, because I mean, I do think that some schools are really in bad shape, but it's really good that you're actually like taking advocacy for this, and because not a lot of people really understand the effects it has on kids. I too myself feel like there could be more to be done, right? Because I feel like we just sit and we do nothing, right? And so sometimes when I think about politicians, they sit in their seats and they say they're really gonna do something for us, but rather do nothing. But for you to step up and say, yes, I'm not afraid and I'm gonna do it, right, is something I can really applaud for, because for you now, of first ever Tibetan descent, to make an impact on not only me but everyone around you, it's amazing. And I'm so proud that I have someone of my heritage that's representing not only Parkdale High Park but me and the whole province of Ontario, and it's great. And connecting to that, we want to know, are you really, in the next 5 to 10 years, let's say, are you planning to do anything to become prime minister?
That's okay. So before I get to that question, let me just say, you're absolutely right that one of the reasons why people feel cynical about politics and why they don't trust politicians is because everybody seems to be saying kind of the right thing. Everybody kind of says what you want to hear, but when it comes to time for action, there's nothing much to show. And even the little action there is almost often a band-aid solution. There's no vision, right? Because elected representatives and politicians have this great weakness of thinking about policy in 4-year cycles. They just keep thinking in terms of elections. But, we need to think longer term. We need to do long-term planning. It doesn't matter that I don't get elected next term. I'm going to make a decision that is going to be a good decision for the long term, not just for the short term, right? So that is something that, we really need to push all levels of government, all elected representatives to do better at. And all of you, and especially as young people, there is this huge responsibility to hold politicians to account, right? You'll see every time, like during graduation and during things, politicians will come for the photo ops and for the speeches. But we need to make sure that they're doing more than that. And as youth, you can make a huge difference in terms of holding politicians accountable, because I believe the youth not only have, a very, very strong sense of fairness in the world, but at the end of the day, it's mostly your futures that we're talking about. Decisions that we're making right now is going to impact you way more than it's going to impact me, right? So because so much of it is impacting you, there is a greater sense of responsibility when it comes to holding politicians accountable, including me, right? You have to hold me accountable as well in what I say and what I do. And jumping off to the following question, no, I don't have plans to be a prime minister. Right now, I'm just focusing on being the best MPP that I can be, and to really make sure that I'm serving my constituents and being a strong voice for the residents of Parkdale High Park at Queen's Park.
What made you run for provincial instead of municipal? Like, why did you, choose that?
Sure. So, one, it was just easier because I was already in provincial politics. But two, and the fact that I was in provincial politics, was very familiar with that system, right? But also in terms of my own passions, public health is a huge passion of mine. Like I've spent so much of my life studying and working on it. Affordable housing, workers' rights issue. These are issues that are governed by the province. So provincial level was the right place to be if I wanted to make a change in that area.
So the next question we have for you, what do you? We want to know what's your perception on Saron Gebresellassi?
Oh, yeah. So I believe she's already publicly announced that she's going to be seeking the nomination. I don't know her very well personally, but from what I have observed in, for example, the mayoral race that she was a candidate in, she brings a great sense of energy, a very different politics. I would say, some of the ideas that she put forward during the mayoralty race was bold, and she performed really well at the debates. So, yeah, I mean, from based on what I've observed, especially because of the mayoralty race, I think that it would be unwise to underestimate her.
Is there anything you want to ask us about?
We've spent a huge chunk of time getting to know me a bit more and learning about my experiences and what I'm doing. But before we wrap up, I really do want to hear a little bit about all of you. Maybe tell me a little bit about yourselves and specifically why this podcast or radio is something that got you interested.
Well, a little bit about myself. I am a singer at this school, so I do a lot of like genres. I do a lot. I'm like country, Nepali, Hindi, Tibetan, English. I'm all over the place, testing all new genres. Right. I'm also a big advocate because I'm in a club called Peace Builders. I work to end bullying and stereotyping. I've worked with a lot of people on just equality. I'm at every Caring Safe Schools committee meetings, making sure our voices are heard, making sure mental health is on the table every day. But what inspired me to start and get a part of this podcast was because I knew that there are other voices that cannot be heard. So I'm here to speak up for them because that's the way we got to make change, right? For the people who don't get to speak their truth, don't get to raise their voices, I'm going to do that because not a lot of people can understand where everyone's coming from. So I wanted to be clear and put it out there to people saying that you don't have to be afraid to share your story because every story is different. We're not all the same. But we're all on the same rainbow, right? And if we listen to each other, we can really find that solution, right? It's not only about separating each other based on party, right? It's not about that, right? It's about coming together, working together as a group, as just human beings, right? And yeah, it's just the inspiration I had from celebrities like Ellen DeGeneres, His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama. I've been just so inspired by his quotes, his talks, his speeches on kindness and warm-heartedness, and just like making that into the curriculum now of schools, because not a lot of people teach that, right? But once we can teach that to kids, it's gonna make a whole new perspective on life,
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, so I wanted to join this radio crew because at first it was Mr. Murray who had the idea of starting a radio show, and then people were like, "Oh no, it's not gonna happen," what a joke. But then I was like, "It's such a great idea," so I wanted to make it happen too. I just feel that this radio it's like a tool that you can communicate to the students, communicate to the kids, and also just inspire others and reach out to people. Because really, like when it comes to high school, you can't really there's no way to really communicate to other people, well, except for social media. So I just think people can listen to it on their phones, on YouTube, wherever, going to school, they can just listen to it. And I just think people always, especially kids, I think our generation, like, we focus too much on visuals, right? Like videos and stuff like that. And we don't really just take the time to, like, listen to things, right? So, yeah, that just really, interests me. And thank you, Mr. Murray, for actually,
Yeah.
coming up with this idea.
Very often people say that great ideas initially get laughed at until it's actually done. So this is an example
It's
of
true.
that.
I've always been a fan of radio, the sort of the medium of radio. Been a big fan of CBC radio as a young age. The morning side, Peter Zosky, just listening to sort of that long form radio. And I agree with Jigme and Eason saying that this sort of medium, I think, allows for a different type of conversation and narrative to happen, and you get the opportunity to get deeper into these issues. And I think in our school board is really trying to find ways to embrace student voice and bring these voices to the forefront to make positive change, like you said, Jigme. So I want to just thank you guys. Did a fantastic job. I want to
Yes.
thank Bhutila from the Lakeshore community for being here.
Oh, I'm happy to. I'm so glad I came. It's been such a great experience.
But yeah, we'll wrap things up here. Thank you so much, Bhutila, for coming out and taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk with us. We really appreciate it. Everybody, that's a wrap up. We have come to the end of the Jigme Kelsang show. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did making it for you all. Make sure you subscribe to our LCI Radio YouTube channel. Don't forget to follow all of our social medias, our Instagram at LCI Radio and our Twitter at LCI Radio 1. Don't forget to follow Ross Murray, our vice principal here at Lakeshore Collegiate Institute, for updates on the interviews and everything that goes on at the LCI Radio 1 podcast station. You can follow him at the Murray Man, and you can follow any updates from the Lakeshore Collegiate Institute Twitter at Lakeshore CI. And you can also follow my new Jigme Kelsang Show Instagram at the Jigme Kelsang Show, plus my Twitter at the Jigme K Show. It's been Jigme Kelsang and the rest of the LCI radio crew, and we will see you next time here on the Jigme Kelsang Show. And we're out. Peace.